little Caleb. So he's going to read us Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 5.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. This word of the Lord.
That was so precious, I want to cry. Okay. Well, hi, everyone. It's good to be back. Good to see all of you. It's been a minute. But I'm going to hold introductions and everything till the end. We can talk after. I'm going to jump right into this. So, the man in black, less than 100 feet behind, and he's gaining. Vizzini leaps off, and he takes out a knife, and he begins to cut the rope, which is tied around a great rock, while Inigo helps the princess to her feet. And Fezzik, the giant of a man, he just stands around and waits for someone to tell him what to do. So nearby are some ruins. Once they were a great castle, now they kind of just resemble Stonehenge. The group stares down at the man in black, climbing and dangling a rope, and he's maybe only 15 feet from the cliff's edge, and his pace is dazzling. He's climbing that rope so fast, but Vizzini, the little man, he cuts through the last of the rope. The rope cracks and slithers across the ground and out of sight over the cliff's edge, like a great serpent going home. Fezzik, the giant, standing with Inigo and Buttercup by the cliff's edge, peer over at the man in black, and the giant mutters with a slight grin, "He has very good arms." The man in black suspends hundreds of feet in the air, now only holding on to the jagged rocks, desperately clinging for his life. And Vizzini, he runs over to the others and stares down at the cliff's face, and he sees the man in black, and he says, "He didn't fall? Inconceivable." Inigo turns and looks at Vizzini, and he says, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." So, if any of you got that reference to the cult classic, The Princess Bride, then you are cultured and welcome to my family dinner. And if you didn't get it, then go rent it and enjoy some laughs this evening. So, Vizzini is this funny mouse of a man he's just this trickster, and he's played by Wallace Shawn. And the funny thing about this movie is he's always using this word inconceivable. It's kind of become this catchphrase just associated with his character. But the really funny thing is he doesn't use it correctly at all through the film. If you notice, he's actually just using it entirely wrong. But what's really ironic about this one scene is he actually uses it right, but then Inigo, I don't think you're actually using it correctly. So it's just whoa. So it's just filled with irony. And so we're coming into our study of the Shema. I know last week we began in it. You studied the heart. In Hebrew, lev, the heart, is quite different than our understanding of the heart today. When we think of the heart, we think of this muscular organ that just pumps blood to the rest of the body, rather matter of fact. Lev to the Hebrew authors was this place, this almost magical place where thoughts, treasures are held, a place where you feel emotions and you make choices from it. So when we hear the Shema in the 21st century, this ancient prayer, we need to have the humility to say what first comes to my mind when I read these words may not have been what the author originally meant. Or as Inigo rightfully realized about his accomplice, we might be using words that we don't actually know what they mean. And so this is certainly the case for the soul, the second part of the Shema prayer. And so a lot has happened since the Shema's conception and 21st century Western America. In fact, a lot happened between the Shema's conception and 1st century AD. Because if you actually realize, or if you read in the Gospels, when Jesus quotes the Shema, he actually has to add another part to it. He actually has to add the mind, just because the way that Hellenic culture understood the heart versus the way Hebraic thought understood the heart. And so the philosophy behind Hellenism, the reason why we start to think about the soul as sort of this ghost in the machine, right? When I say soul, that's what we think about. We think some invisible reality. It's a cool word. Some invisible reality within me that I guess like keeps going after death, right? It's me, but it's not me. I don't really know. So that kind of idea, that kind of ghost in the machine thought really came from some very popular thinkers, Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. Okay, so they were like the leading philosophers behind Hellenic thought. And so I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying it's something we need to be aware that when we read to love the Lord your God with all your soul, we may not be actually understanding what the biblical authors intended us to think about and to understand when we read the Shema. And so today's goal is to kind of recover this biblical understanding of the soul, but more importantly, in the words of the Shema, to learn to love God with that soul, whatever it may be, and to love others with it as well. So, this will be fun. Let's do this Shema, and I'll do a line, and then you guys just say it back, okay? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Okay, so now we'll do the first part in Hebrew. Would you guys like that? Okay, so you can say it back to me. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Echad was a little struggling there for some of you guys. It's all right, it was great. So this is one of the most famous, that was horrible grammar. This is one of the most famous and important prayers in Scripture, and especially for many people even still today. It's still recited multiple times a day, and in the ancient culture it was to be said 2 times per day. And this prayer, when you're reading Deuteronomy, it's contextually embedded in this powerful, powerful moment of Moses' final speech to the Israelites. So he knows they're going out into the promised land, and he knows he cannot go with them. It's kind of, in a sense, it's sort of like a deathbed conversation for Moses, that he's seeing people go on before him, and he knows that his moment is up. And so it's this powerful, powerful, it becomes this powerful, powerful identity for the Jewish people, for the Israelis as they are going into the promised land. And so it becomes sort of like the Pledge of Allegiance, or the Lord's Prayer, or the Adhan, or Hotel California, depending on which community and values you're brought up with. Okay, it sort of becomes this defining melody behind your existence. The uvecho nafshecha, and with all your soul. So nephesh, you heard me say it in there, uvecho, so and with all nafshecha, your soul. So nephesh is the Hebrew word for soul, but it has a wide variety of usages. So it's actually used over 750 times in the Old Testament, and it means primarily life, for possessing life, but we'll just read a few of the contexts of how it appears. So the word sometimes indicates the whole person. So for instance, in Genesis 2:7, it says, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living nephesh." Likewise, in Judges 16:16, I find this one very funny. It says that Samson was tired to the death of his nephesh, of Delilah's nagging. And it can also refer to the throat or the neck. So when recounting the story of Joseph, the psalmist says, "They bruised his feet with shackles and placed his nephesh in irons." And the word is also used in the Old Testament to refer to sort of this inner life, this thing that goes beyond the body. And so when the psalmist says in Psalm 42, when he says, "As a deer longs for the streams of water, so my nephesh longs for you. And then lastly, the word also kind of refers to this emotional state. So in Job 30:25, was not my nephesh grieved for the needy? And then in Psalm 107, their courage, it's their nephesh, melted away in anguish. So there's this numerous ways that nephesh is used in Scripture, which both helps us, okay, because it gives us sort of this multifaceted understanding of this word, but then also it becomes really, really difficult to contain that well and to speak of it well. And it especially becomes really complicated then when we have such a high command to love the Lord your God with your nephesh. Because as we just saw, it's the whole body, but it's also parts of the body, but it's also this inner person, but it's also this emotion, and it's also sort of this bigger than reality of your person. Like when you don't even have words to describe, like my body hurts, or it's like my soul, right? And we still actually use this word sometimes commonly when speaking about just something deep within us, of like my soul is tired or my soul is happy, right? But we still use that word today. And so we could read the 750 passages in the Old Testament and be very good seminary students and find all of its various usages, but that doesn't mean that we're going to appropriately use our soul in our love for God. Okay? So I'll help us out a little bit here and just give us some handles on the way to think biblically about what is the soul. The soul is your entire being. Okay? Your soul is your entire person. It's not this sort of transcendent ghost in the machine or somehow removed from our physicality. Okay, that's Hellenic thinking. The biblical understanding of the soul is it is your entire person. You are a soul. Okay, I love one of my professors, he says, in the Shema, then, to love the Lord with your soul is to offer your entire being with all of its capabilities and limitations in an effort to love God. To offer your entire being with all its capabilities and limitations in an effort to love God. So that, my friends, is what it means to love God with your soul and follow the Shema. So I could end the sermon there, and I think the little kids would be stoked on having a short little message. But we know that the Shema is not isolated to the Hebrew Scriptures, right? We know it comes out later, and actually from someone that we consider to be very, very important to our faith, Jesus. Jesus himself believed the Shema was a summary of the 10 Commandments, which were a synthesis of the 613 laws. So the Shema to Jesus is of utter importance. In a way, it's the thesis statement of the entire Hebrew Scriptures. So let's read about it in Matthew 22. Let's read about just this instance when it comes up. So in Matthew 22, verses 35 through 40, it says, one of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments." You see what Jesus did there? Jesus doesn't undermine the Shema, but he does amend it. He goes to our favorite book in the Bible, Leviticus, okay, and he pulls Leviticus 19:18, and he weaves it into the Shema. And so notice this. We need to notice the man's first his tone in asking, right? Why does he ask him? He asks to test or to tempt him, depending upon your translation. So now, in one sense, this is an entirely legitimate question. Okay, if you want to know kind of like what first century religious culture was like, discussions of how important certain laws were versus others were very common. It's like you go to the local pub and you get whatever craft beer you like, and you talk about for hours why you think your craft beer is better than so-and-so's craft beer, and also why you think this law is more important than this law, or this is more weightier than this, and we can leave this behind, but not this. That was just first century religious culture. And so, this isn't entirely radical in what this man is doing, saying, what's the law? He's basically saying, what do you think is the most important thing in our faith? But he's testing Jesus, because if Jesus' answer somehow renounces the 613 laws that they consider to be equally binding, if it goes against one of those, then they've cornered him and they can get him killed. Because we know in Matthew, this is nearing the end of the story where Jesus' fate is going to be the cross. And so they're trying to entrap him here. Okay, in a way, this is similar to being asked, which is your favorite kid? Like, you're just going to lose that conversation. Like, that is a trap and a half right there. You are going to lose. But Jesus, of course, cool and collected, he does something absolutely magical. So let's unpack that here. He quotes the Shema, but then he amends it. He adds Leviticus 19:18, which says to love your neighbor as yourself. So I like what a New Testament scholar, his name is Scott McKnight, he says when Jesus answered in reply to this with the Shema, but adding Leviticus 19:18, he transforms it into the Jesus Creed. And so I like that. This is the Jesus Creed. So, but Jesus is not criticizing Judaism. Okay, we need to understand that. Loving others is central to Judaism, but it's not central to the creed of Judaism. It's not central to the Shema. If you read the Shema, it has nothing to say about what to do with others. Okay, it's only this sort of vertical relationship. But the emphasis, and so that emphasis to love others, that horizontal emphasis is not found in the Shema the way that Jesus makes it abundantly clear in the Jesus Creed. Because Jesus replied, let's look at his reply again. So it says, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your soul, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. What was the guy's question again? What is the greatest commandment? And what does Jesus say? Well, here's the first, and the second's like it. So you mean, here's the first most important and the second most important? No. That's not what Jesus is saying. He's much more clever than that. Here's the first, and the second's like it. So then which one's the greatest? Jesus? Well, this is the first, is to love God, and the second is like it, to love your neighbor. So are there two or are there one? Yes. They're both the greatest because they are not exclusive of one another. In Jesus' imagination, you cannot love God without loving neighbor. And you cannot truly love neighbor without loving God. One cannot cancel out the other. Jesus weaves them together so tightly to where it's impossible for them to not coexist. So your personal relationship to God is completely interwoven and indistinguishable from your relationship to other imago Dei, image of God bearing humans. So in Jesus' imagination, you love God by loving your neighbor, and when you love your neighbor, you're loving God. And there is no alternative in Jesus' mind. And to love God with all your soul, okay, specifically about what we're thinking about this weekend, to love God with your soul means to love your neighbor as yourself with all your soul, which as we learned is your entire being. Okay, that's a lot to ask for, Jesus. Okay, I was all good with the Shema, right? Like, love God. Sweet. He's nice to me, right? My neighbor, though, the one whose dog be pooping in my yard, we got a problem here, right? We like the Shema. But what Jesus does with the Shema, when we really look at it and see what Jesus is saying, we got some problems. If we're really going to read it how Jesus spoke it, there's some problems. Okay? Because, again, it's easy to read the Shema and just go, yes, God, you're my Father, my shepherd, my ocean-walking, blessed lion and lamb. But then he says, go love your neighbor with your whole soul, and then you're loving me. So St. Augustine, I think he just said it brilliantly. He said, anyone who thinks that he has understood the divine scriptures or any part of them, but cannot by his understanding build up his double love of God and neighbor, has not yet succeeded in understanding them. If you think you've mastered the scriptures and you're not loving neighbor, we haven't even begun. So we hear this, right? We hear this. This isn't necessarily new information. It's just kind of that gut check, like, oh, I didn't want to show up this Sunday because this is really hard. Like, why couldn't we talk about like a miracle or something? This isn't new information, okay? To love God with all your soul means to love your neighbor as yourself, with all your soul, with your entire being. We know this, but we don't listen. We can't even listen to what Jesus says is the creed of our faith. But Jesus was quite aware of this, right? In the way that he addressed people, he said, though seeing they won't see, though hearing they won't hear or understand. He knew that this would be difficult. Okay? This predicament of what was the greatest commandment happened more than once, actually. So it doesn't just take place in Matthew, it's recorded in Luke as well. But I think Luke records a different incident, but kind of same little conversation going down. If you look at the context, it just seems different from Matthew and Luke. So this apparently didn't happen just one time. And it wouldn't. This is what you do at the local pub. You say, what's the greatest commandment? Right? Jesus, that's just Friday night for Jesus. What does your Friday night look like? Because I want mine to look like that. So it happens again in Luke. So in Luke 10, 25 through 29, we'll read that now. On one occasion, an expert in the law, once again, stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? Jesus replied, how do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this, and you'll live. And then on the next slide, 29, we cannot miss 29. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, who's my neighbor? So this man actually recites the Jesus Creed. He gets an A+ in seminary. Okay, he was there that last Friday in the pub, and he was like, I'm not gonna say something else than that, right? I'm gonna get the A+ from Jesus, and he wants to prove himself. Okay. But notice verse 29. He wanted to justify himself. To translate that, he wants to know the limits of how far this has to be taken. Okay? What is the bare minimum I have to do to inherit life? And we laugh, but that's us. That's us. This reveals so much about how we hear the Jesus Creed. Love God and love neighbors. Okay, but who's my neighbor? What does love actually mean? Let's think about it. Let's have a Bible study on what love actually means. So we just make sure we're doing it, okay? That's why we're doing it. And what about We begin to ask questions, not for clarity to love God better, but often for how we can love our neighbor less. We don't always ask these questions for clarity. I don't, okay? I am like sitting with you guys right now. My soul is with, my nephesh is there. I ask these questions so many times to say, what is the least I can do and still be faithful? Like, you got a back door into heaven for me because I want to take that way. Like, I really don't want to love my neighbor with my whole soul. That's where we're wrong. This is where we're wrong, because that's not how faithfulness is measured, or love. There is no back door to love. Love is hard. Love is very, very hard. But we have seen a love so great that how can we not share that and show that with others? And if we're not sharing that and showing that with others, do we actually understand how great that love is that we have been shown? So Jesus has, I think, just through prose, really articulated how loving God and loving neighbor is interwoven. Okay, and I was just saying how we don't listen well to that. Okay, that's not new information. We've read the Shema. You've probably heard a message like this before. It's not fancy. Okay. The past year of my life has been surrounded with research of the imagination and story. If just ask KB and she will say, I'm sick of hearing about the imagination. That's what my thesis is on, and specifically its integration with story. And what I've found in my research about story, what first kind of captivated it to me, is you sit down with someone and you say, let me tell you about this legislation that has been passed. Like, they tune out, man. They are not in that conversation anymore. You go, man, I got a story for you. They go, tell me more. I like stories, right? We just drink up stories as humans. We love stories. No matter how young, how old. That's why I started this message with a story, because it just tunes our ears and says, I want to know how this ends. Okay, and I like what C.S. Lewis has to say about this, that story allows us to sneak past the watchful dragons of reason. That there can be something so outlandish in the story, but we give it grace because we're like, but it's a story. We like stories. It doesn't matter that the guy just jumped 20 feet to dodge the bullet. Like, we like stories. We'll let that pass. Okay, so it shouldn't then surprise us then after this conversation in Luke that Jesus tells a story. Because he knows that we hear, that though seeing they don't see, though hearing they do not hear or understand. So Jesus offers this man and the listening group a story. And if you are in church world, if you are in church culture, this story is very familiar. And that's not helpful. Okay, because stories, we tend to listen to them less the more we hear them. Remember that first time you heard that story and you're like, oh man, it's amazing. And then you try and retell it and you're like, that story stinks. It was so much better the first time. It's because the more sometimes, and not always, but sometimes the more we approach a story, the magic fades from it. But it's not the story. It's actually our ability to embrace the story, for our imaginations to be captivated by the story. And so I'm going to read this parable aloud in a very friendly reading translation, the NLT. And so, with all we've heard about loving God and others with our soul, and that to love God is to love neighbor, and to love neighbor is to love God, I invite you to be captivated by this story. Okay? And if that means closing your eyes, if it means staring off and imagining or staring at the taxidermed owl, enter into this story in a way that you have never before. And if you've never heard this story, then good for you. And I invite you to consider it. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, a windy stretch filled with lurking shadow. He was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at the man lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan, the one whom Jews thought were traitors and worshipped and lived in defilement and filth, came along. And when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with oil and wine and bandaged him. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. And if his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here." Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked. The man replied, "The one who showed him mercy." Then Jesus said, "Yes, now go and do the same." To love God with your soul, your entire being, means to love your neighbor as yourself. The neighbor who even may be known as the other side, or the one who's not like me, or the one living in filth and sin. Because if we're not loving the other, nor practicing loving the enemy, then we are not loving God with our soul, our entire being. And this is a haunting statement. This is one of those parables that ends, and when you really consider it in light of the conversation that just took place about the Jesus Creed, it is a haunting story, because you realize, I'm not doing this. Now make no mistake, Jesus' words here are not then a recommendation of what could be called situationalism, which is this view that there is no principle for Christian conduct other than to do the most loving thing in a situation. Okay, rather, Jesus' words, they direct us to understand and apply the commandments of the law within the context of an obligation to love God and to love neighbor. And that's difficult. There are so many things in my life right now where I'm probably doing them wrong. I'm really trying to figure out how to put those things under the commandment to love God and to love others. And that's really difficult work. But it's worth it. You too, okay, likely have someone in mind at this moment. While I was reading that story, maybe you're the Samaritan. Maybe someone you know is the Samaritan. Maybe you were one of the first religious leaders who just walked by them. I'll never forget, this is off the cusp. I'm so embarrassed by this story, but again, I want to preach up, not preach down. I was late for this Bible study, man, and I was so excited to be there because I thought they were going to announce my name in front of people and interview me and be like, look at the amazing stuff this guy is doing. And so I was full blown, blaring worship in the car, just I'm ready to reflect God purely here. And I'm driving, and I look to my right, and there's this man on a bicycle. And I'm driving. It's one of those where almost at the same speed, and he hits the curve wrong, and he goes flying off and crashes. And legit, I kept going. So I was like, I want the praise of man. And I didn't know that in the moment, but that story haunts me. Because I was either the first or the second of those people who passed by the Samaritan. And so that story in my own life has kind of become this embodiment of do not let that happen again. It's so interesting, the man's reply. So Jesus has clearly said this man is the Samaritan, right? He makes a point, and we don't have time to go into the kind of the historical, cultural moment, but whoa, okay, take the person that you think is in the pile, and Jesus says that's them. Okay. It's to the point to where when Jesus finishes the story, the man can't even say the Samaritan. He can't even name him. Look at his reply. Jesus says, who? So now which of these three would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? And he says, the one who showed him mercy. He says it through clenched teeth. He can't even name the Samaritan. He thinks they are so beneath him. He does not even want to say their name. And this is tough right here. If we cannot name the neighbor in our life, if we cannot name the Samaritan in our life, then how can we expect to love them? If we cannot look at the other side and say, this is their name and their story, how can we expect to love them with our whole soul? And in reflection of that, how can then we expect to love God with our whole soul? Remember what Jesus does with the creed. You can't separate them. So when reflecting on this question of how do we love neighbor out of an expression of how to love God, C.S. Lewis, I love Lewis. He just says, don't waste your time bothering whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you did. As soon as we do this, we find one of the great secrets. When you are behaving as if you love someone, you will presently come to love them. We could sit around our whole lives, and I do this, I twiddle my thumbs in my back office, and I'm like, am I loving this community well? And Lewis is like, go do it. Then you have your answer. And if you're not, you'll come to love them. Because you have experienced a love so great, how can you not then infuse that into the story that you're living? And so I studied revivals a little bit in church history, and it's amazing how all great revivals have begun with murmuring lips of repentant sinners crying out for God. And so in this moment, with your neighbor on your mind, your neighbor being that brother, sister, daughter, son, father, mother, pastor, neighbor, forgotten friend, coworker, politician, or enemy, ask for God's strength to love them. So we're going to do a little bit of guided prayer right now. There's going to be directions on the screen. Ooh, I should not have chosen orange. So the first one's going to be thinking of your neighbor and asking God for help to love them as he has loved you. The second is ask God for forgiveness for the ways you have not loved him or neighbor well. And 3 is ask God's help to love him and neighbor now and in the coming days, and to be filled with the knowledge of his great love. And I'll read those out as we enter into this time. So for about 30 seconds, we're going to spend on each of these guided prayers. So first, think of your neighbor and ask God for help to love them as he has loved you. Okay, now we will spend some time asking God for forgiveness for the ways that we have not loved him or our neighbor well. Okay, and now we will ask for God's help, his miraculous help, to love him and neighbor now in the coming days, and to be filled with the knowledge of his great love. It's a vulnerable morning here. I recognize there's tears, and I was honestly tentative to preach this way. I could have just gone like full blown, let me impress them with Bible stuff. But then I thought, if this is really what Jesus taught, okay, if this is the pinnacle of what Jesus believed, if this is the Jesus creed, should we not take it seriously? If we're not going to take this seriously, then why are we showing up? Truly was the thought in my head, is if I'm not going to preach this well, if I'm not going to take this seriously or help us to take it seriously, why are we coming on Sunday? Why are we wasting our life with this? And I know so many of you, your hearts is, I want to do this well. I do not want to waste this life. I want to do this well. And God honors that. I am reminded of Christ's restoration of the disciples as I was writing this sermon. time and time again, this restoration. Me and my brother-in-law, we call them mini conversions. MANYMINI conversions. He offers that to the disciples time and time and time again. And he offers that to us time and time and time again. And this stirs in me then the reason I have hope, because of who God is. This brings me back to the character of God, because we could make the Jesus creed our creed and somehow not do it right. Not actually do it out of love. Doing it out of wanting to impress God or wanting to impress neighbor. And so this reminds me of the character of God. Because of who God is, I am able to confront the ways in which I have failed, demonstrating that reason to love him and to love neighbor. But I'm also able to receive the grace already paid for in renewing that mission continually within me. There's a beautiful reward we experience on earth for loving God and neighbor too. Okay, this isn't just that we now have to live our lives loving a neighbor we don't really want to love, and it's just going to be a painful existence. But the reward is that as we enter further into that love of loving that neighbor, a greater understanding of the expression of love, of the love of God, will be refined and reflected in us. It's a win-win. This is as much for neighbor as for us, I think God would tell us. And so my prayer for us this week, and my challenge for you, is to, you look at the early church, and they're struggling with this, especially Ephesians, the church in Ephesus. So my challenge for you is to read Ephesians 3. That's going to be my benediction at the end of the day. But my challenge is to read that each day this week, and to pray for a rejuvenated knowledge of God's love, so you may have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep his love is. Loving is not easy. It's not easy at all. But it's worth it. Do you think the cross was easy? It was worth it. You think loving neighbor is easy? It's worth it. Again, I'm a living testament of one whose love for God and neighbor fumbles and falters every day. But we have grace where sin abounds, and his Spirit to guide us as we walk in the new life he has given us. And so I'm going to pray Ephesians 3 over us. I'm going to read it and just embrace this calling from the Father. I pray to the Father, the creator of everything in heaven and on earth. I pray that from his glorious, unlimited resources, that he will empower you with strength through his Spirit. Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust him. Your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. And may you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep his love is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it is too great to understand fully. Then you will be made complete with all the fullness of life and power that comes from God. I invite you to consider that this week. I invite you to embrace the mission of the Jesus Creed, but looking at the character of God clearly as you're doing it. So thank you. I ask that you stand as we close in worship now.